The years following the financial crisis would be brutal, but not catastrophic. In 2009, American unemployment would peak at over 10%. Much of Britain's economy would close down and would stay down, while Europe would enter a deep malaise. People were not destitute, like the Great Depression, or the years after the major wars, but the nations of the West were precarious, so much of the populations teetering on the edge, just barely squeezing by. In 2010, the American Affordable Care Act would be passed, initially highly controversial, although with large segments of the population feeling quite optimistic toward it. Over time, support would wane. People would begin to see more and more corruption in the insurance industry, in the pharmaceutical industry, and in food. Americans were getting sicker and sicker. Faced with declining sales and increased regulations, particularly during the 1980s and 90s, tobacco companies sought to diversify their holdings. Major tobacco companies had developed a treasure trove of research based around addictive potential, some of it growing out of American military medical research, such as the Air Force's Armstrong Laboratory, yet much of it developed on their own. Enormous acquisitions of food companies would be seen throughout the 1980s and 90s. R.J. Reynolds would acquire Nabisco, Philip Morris acquiring Kraft, General Foods, and acquiring Nabisco from Reynolds. Beverage companies would be an enormous target area, such as Kool-Aid, Hawaiian Punch, Capri Sun, and Tang. They would apply much of their addictive research to the food businesses that they had acquired. These products would become enormously popular. People would love consuming them, yet Americans would become sickly. There were major pollutants in the air, land, and water, and now, the very food they ate. In turn, the pharmaceutical industry would rise, though not merely from this. Rates of prescription would increase rapidly, with doctors being incentivized to prescribe drugs, far outside the realm of what any other country, or history, would have deemed reasonable. This would culminate in its worst episode, the overprescription of opiate painkillers, particularly oxycodone and hydrocodone. Pharmaceutical companies would become enormous lobbyers, enormous purchasers of television advertising time. They would even go so far as to begin their own medical journals and hold medical research conferences. They became so ingrained in the legislature and the regulators that by the time the Affordable Care Act was passed, they had exerted enormous regulatory capture. They were able to craft legislation around their needs, building webs connecting hospitals, pharmaceutical company-owned pharmacy benefit plans, pharmacies, doctors, and the regulators, ensuring a constant flow of enormous capital, all while Americans got sicker and sicker. There would be a sizable public response in 2011 when the rating agency S&P would downgrade the U.S. Treasury. Around this time, a heavy debate around the debt ceiling would begin to emerge. People were beginning to become alarmed by the large amount of debt that was constantly coming out of the American government. Partisan gridlock intensified, while distrust of the government grew. By 2012, the Federal Reserve's policy of quantitative easing had spread to far more assets than before, buying securities that never would have been deemed acceptable in the past. The economies of the West were slowly recovering, although institutions like the Bank of England and the European Central Bank were keeping them on life support, constantly pumping liquidity into the system, with the Federal Reserve the key driver of it all. The economies of the West survived on financialization and debt, while the real economy, unrecognizable. In Britain, the expenses scandal would deal a major blow to trust in the government. In 2009, it would be revealed that members of Parliament were misusing public expenses, leading to a sizable backlash. In the United States, Edward Snowden would reveal a vast surveillance apparatus being utilized by the NSA. Americans began to get the sense that their liberties were eroding, and perhaps even that the American state viewed the population as a threat. Europe would enter a series of economic crises at this time. A Greek budget deficit in 2009 would trigger a widespread debt crisis in the European Union. In May of 2010, Greece would receive its first of many bailout packages from the EU and IMF, though the EU would impose heavy austerity. There were many problems inherent in the European Union system. The national governments of Europe maintained separate sovereign debts, the Germans issuing bunds, the French OATs, the Italians BTPs, etc. yet they all operated on a shared currency. In most cases, the populations of Europe were not privy to these economic decisions. Their leaders knew that the populations would never accept joining into these international structures and systems in such a way, so they unilaterally brought their countries in. And now, with separate debts but shared currencies, this advantaged certain countries in Europe while devastating others, as by necessity, with different types of economies, the currencies of some nations should be valued more highly than others. Yet when they're all forced to operate on the same currency, that would misalign their economies with their currency, drawing capital to some and siphoning it from others. Ireland would be bailed out in November 2010, Portugal in May of 2011, and all the while, the centralization of power in the European Union would increase. The Lisbon Treaty would take effect, creating a permanent president of the European Council, and significantly increasing the power of the European Parliament. And by 2010 and 2011, a deep, wide-reaching sovereign debt crisis had come to encompass Europe. It was self-evident that Europe's system was unsustainable, just as the Eurodollar banking systems was. This could not run much longer, and eventually, European debts would be forced into a state of default. This left Europe in a predicament. The ruling factions that had come to dominate not only the European Union, but most of the European national governments, were not willing to give up their system, and that which gave them wealth, power, prestige, and purpose. If they knew that the clock was ticking on a deeper, more permanent sovereign debt crisis, then they would need to make sure that their system would survive, even as that occurred. This would require capital controls, and require that no country remained an economic safe haven while the others broke down. Europe would all have to go down together, and the capital would have to be kept from leaving. They would begin investigating how to accomplish this, and throughout the following years, begin laying the groundwork for a system that would allow them to keep capital in Europe and restart the monetary system should another crisis occur. And even as the economies began to limp back, leaving the period of true acute crisis, social dissatisfaction was extremely high, and the ability for the ruling institutions to maintain narrative control was deteriorating rapidly. Throughout the 2010s, social media had increasingly become dominant across the political and social spheres. And as these platforms increasingly became where more and more people interfaced with the broader world, the momentum for alternative political positions would increase rapidly. A new left was rapidly emerging. This left that emerged in the 2010s is a curious hybrid. It took many of its ideas from the adapted critical theory of the new left that emerged in academia during the 1960s and 70s. They particularly drew inspiration from the newer forms of critical race theory, from queer theory, and from the emergent theories of intersectionality. Though this emerged from a long process of the new left in academia, much of its ideas evolved on social media, and as students brought them to universities, it created a feedback loop. As ideas proliferated on social media, particularly on Tumblr originally, they would find their main audience with young students, particularly women, which would in turn reverberate in academia, encompass more and more of academics, and feed back into the college students. Many corporate interests began to pick up on this. They had taken a bad hit in the social sphere as a result of the 2008 crisis, and some came to believe that since these new notions were based entirely around identity characteristics and not finances and economics, then they could play into them, hoping to placate the radicals that opposed them. After all, it's easier to put a black square up on your Facebook page than to actually rework how you make money. And so this began to grow in the corporate sphere. And as these college students, heavily engrossed in these ideals, graduated, many of them found their way into those companies. And so more and more of corporate administrators came to hold these ideals as well. At the same time, this would grow quite prominent in media, further proliferating these ideas. And while the neoliberal globalist corporatists who ran the political institutions were fearing the brewing backlashes against them, they as well noticed an opportunity. They would increasingly come to adopt many of these notions. Yet here too we see another feedback system. More and more true believers believed that the political apparatus was their route to instantiating these ideas, and they became part of the political apparatus directly. Eventually, this new left became inseparable from the left-of-center political apparatus of the global neoliberals, such as the American Democrat Party or Britain's Labour. Yet ultimately, it would still be globalist neoliberalism that was dominant in the political apparatus. All the while, there was a powerful brewing populist revolt across the West. For decades, the lower classes had watched their wealth evaporate. The promises of the globalized system were untrue, while the upper classes could continue to maintain that there were cheaper appliances in the stores. The lower classes had no future. Many of them couldn't afford a $50 emergency, let alone a new TV. Their towns were gone, their factories left to rust, their children and siblings killed in foreign wars for what seemed to be no purpose. And as they looked around, everywhere they saw deaths of despair and hopelessness. But more than that, they felt that the ruling classes hated them. And they were right. The ruling classes of the West relied on a right-to-rule story about liberalism. In order to maintain a right-to-rule narrative, it had to be such that their liberal interventions had uplifted the downtrodden, yet all they had to show for it was mass incarceration, towns destroyed, the rural poor white population left to wither away, the upward mobility of the black population ceased, and their family units broken, hopelessness, deaths of despair, crime, sickness, worsening and worsening poverty, and deaths overseas for no discernible reason. It would often be such that there would be a lower class town who would be the recipient of an upper class liberal elite policy. It could be something like a tax policy, welfare, economic regulation, or a social policy. Perhaps an urban neighborhood with an integration policy, or a poor rural town with a new economic regulation. Regardless of what it was, very often one of these policies would arise, and this lower class community would object to it, complaining that it had made their lives worse, that it wasn't working, and it was hurting them. Yet when the ruling class heard this, it put them in a dilemma. If they were to accept the complaints of the lower class, then this would mean that their liberal interventions were not uplifting. And of course, if they were to accept that, that would mean their right-to-rule narrative was in question. Therefore, accepting the lower class at its word would mean destroying their own right-to-rule story. So, either the lower classes were right, and their policies were making their lives worse, or the lower classes simply didn't understand what they were doing. After all, these people didn't have the university education that they did. They didn't see the big picture. The little people simply didn't understand what was best for them. Yet sometimes the elite classes would respond with a more aggressive message, figuring that either the lower classes didn't understand what they were trying to do, didn't understand what was best for them, or they actively wanted people to be downtrodden. Because if you presume a priori what the ruling class is doing is uplifting people, then somebody objecting to it must want people not to be uplifted. Well, after years and years of this message, and all while the international financial system constantly siphoned their wealth, being told that it was a great thing, the lower classes had come to hate the liberal elites of the coasts. It was an irreconcilable difference. They were tired of getting poorer, they were tired of being hopeless, they were tired of having their futures robbed from them, they were tired of the death, they were tired of the disease, but perhaps worse than that, they were tired of being talked down to. That it was their own fault because they were just too stupid and backward. During these years, so much of the economies of the West had been moved to China. The financial class had become extraordinarily wealthy by moving the capital of the West overseas and benefiting its labor and industry. Yet China had a great deal of experience with the Western empires, stretching back centuries. They were fully aware of the influence that the West's financial class was attempting to exert. They knew all too well how this imperial class would enter a civilization, financialize it, acquire the real assets for themselves, and use that vast wealth to dominate the civilization. And they wanted them out. China, which had been the recipient of a great deal of Western capital, began to turn away. They had achieved their economic boom, but they didn't want a Western empire owning their country. They would begin building their own networks, creating vast international networks of capital and infrastructure, most notably with the Belt and Road Initiative. All the while they would begin restricting Western capital. And as China seemed to be increasingly more and more off the table, this financial web began looking elsewhere. They increasingly moved capital to Southern Asia, in countries like Vietnam. They would increase their efforts in India, Singapore as well, and very notably, Dubai and Qatar. Just as Venice had moved to Amsterdam and Amsterdam to London all those years ago, it came to look more and more as though Dubai and Qatar would be the new home for capital. Intelligence agencies across the West became increasingly entrenched in Qatar, and more of the international banking web would build a new home in Dubai. People tend to think of empires as being like the extension of a nation. The Spanish Empire being like Spain spreading out across the world, or Portugal reaching in to make Brazil part of its nation. Yet with these vast financial empires, there's something quite curiously different. To an extent, the British Empire was an extension of Britain, spreading British ideas, British influence, and British people around the world. Yet that wasn't the entire empire, nor is it the empire now. That vast network of business, finance, relationships, and influence that based itself in London, it was its own entity, with Britain more like its home, the British peoples its host. And so seeing something strange like the Shard, Britain's tallest building, being owned by Qatar is not quite so bizarre, as the banking hubs like Singapore and the Cayman Islands, the vast international networks of business and finance, those are the real London Empire, and now the new hubs of Dubai and Qatar, owning such substantial London property, can be seen as the British Empire continuing to own London, just in a new form, yet now draining the United Kingdom and building up its opulent grandeur elsewhere. It's that same unbroken entity of old, just now draining its old host and leaving as it withers away. And as this empire has taken on its leaders and beneficiaries from around the world, parking its wealth in far-off lands, is it really a British Empire? What exactly is it? This financial machine? Either way, it is no friend to the British peoples. Western intelligence, particularly MI6 and the CIA, had been deeply involved in Islamic radicalism for the past decade and more. They had funded and fueled many of these Islamist organizations, creating networks of radicals, and ones that they could easily agitate at a moment's notice. Ones that would ensure that the Arab states would never become stable enough to resist them. This was a reflection of something the British Empire had done for centuries now, constantly playing the Arabs off of each other. They would fund, finance, and train radical organizations, very often ones that their militaries would end up fighting only years later. They would even go so far as to involve themselves in the childhood curriculums of Islamic nations, always making sure that there was a radical army ready to fight and a Middle East that was never truly sovereign, all while draining the world's wealth and moving it to their new hub in Dubai. It seems as though the global war on terror did accomplish some goals after all. New innovations in technology were really coming to alarm the ruling institutions. Increasingly, social media was where people got their information, where ideas were discussed. And as the years of the 2010s rolled on, they would begin displacing traditional media sources, not only in cultural relevance, but in business. A 2016 report would show that Facebook's revenues from advertising had beaten traditional media companies, and beaten them by a lot. This sent shockwaves around the industry, and media companies began to view the rising tech firms as an enemy. They began a campaign running constant attacks against the firms, hoping to drive users out and back to them as a source of media. They attempted to exert pressure and gain influence, particularly over the content that they would promote and push down. Political figures came to get involved, with so much political power now being held within these tech firms, where so much of the cultural and political conversation was occurring. It was an enormous risk not to have a grip. When there were a handful of large print media and television media companies, then the ruling political factions were able to exert control, particularly on television, with only a few key networks, and networks heavily regulated by the government. The ruling factions had enormous say over what would be shown to the public. Yet social media allowed anyone to share their stories. It allowed anything to proliferate, and this was dangerous to power. Both the traditional media companies and many political actors began to attempt to box in the tech firms, all while distrust was only increasing. The financial crisis of 2008 would take distrust of the monetary system from a relatively small and fringe movement and turn it into something much larger. The rise and proliferation of cryptocurrencies would pose as an alternative to the hegemonic might of the credit-based dollar-euro-dollar system, particularly with the explosion of Bitcoin. And though it hasn't risen to become a peer rival of the dollar, it has allowed people to think, what if there were another way? People wanted to set up their own parallel monetary system. Opposition to the status quo was fierce, active, and growing. People also began looking to traditional hard assets, with so much distrust over the enormous financialized system, one based on perpetual debt. People began to wonder if the economy should return to a system based around real hard assets. Many physical assets had been beaten down for some time, not only as more and more of the economy had moved to the financialized debt system, but because of how the old European empires continued to exist, not only via their banking networks and conglomerates, but through control of natural resources. Here's a scenario to consider. Imagine that you live in a country that was once controlled by the empire. You achieved your independence and were nominally free. However, you would like to start a business. So, first you have to go to the government, a government which is heavily influenced by the empire via their foreign aid, economic relationships, and their intelligence apparatus. Once you get your documents in order, you must go to a bank owned by the empire, from whom you receive a loan. Now you start acquiring supplies. Perhaps you need metal. You go to a foundry, which receives its metal from a mine owned by the empire. Once you have all your supplies, you begin creating your product. But you need to ship it. So you load it onto a ship owned by the empire and insure it with an insurance company owned by the empire. I would dare say that you are still in the empire. With so much financial power controlled by the empire, and so many natural resource companies like oil, gas, and mining companies owned by imperial companies, this gave the old colonial empires the ability to manipulate commodity prices. They could do this through control of the physical commodity supply, such as France's control of Niger's uranium, or they could do this through financial means. With such a vast amount of artificially cheap credit, imperial financial firms can lever up futures contracts and use those to artificially push down commodity prices. On top of that, with so much forex trading going through London and via the British pound as an intermediary currency, London has had enormous sway over international currency prices, with control over shipping, insurance, currency, natural resource extraction, and commodity futures. Losing physical colonial land didn't mean losing financial power over those resources, and to a large extent, the old empires of Europe have been able to continue their dominance over world commodities. For centuries, the same playbook has been observed. The Empire Man arrives on new land. He goes to the people, telling them that he is their friend. For the sake of this example, he tells the inhabitants that they can become much wealthier if they were to produce only cocoa. The inhabitants balk at this. We cannot live on only cocoa. But the Empire Man has an explanation. Produce only cocoa, and you will be the best producer. You will have a unique comparative advantage. If everyone makes the thing that they are best at, then we have more of everything. So produce only cocoa, and I will sell it for you. I will bring you back far more riches than you could have had otherwise, and you can use that to buy what you need. You will all end up with far more plenty than you could have had before. So the inhabitants set to work and begin producing cocoa for the Empire. The Empire Man sells their cocoa, and they thank him, as he demands only a small cut. But to compete, the inhabitants find that they must take out loans which the Empire Man's bank is happy to originate. The Empire Man, through his banking system, creates money for himself. The Empire Man, with his great financial wealth and financial instruments, goes to the futures market and pushes down the price of cocoa. And all while the Empire Man's friends have become more and more integrated in the inhabitants' land, the inhabitants find themselves facing war, famine, and disease, their sons dying in imperial wars, and they go deeper and deeper into debt. While the price of cocoa goes down and down, seemingly inexplicably, they must produce more, and all while their society comes under worse and worse strain. Eventually, the inhabitants say to the Empire Man, "We simply can't pay you back. We simply can't make enough money selling cocoa anymore." But the Empire Man again says that he is their friend, and offers them a way out of their crippling debt. "Simply give your farms and lands to me, and your debt will be forgiven." The inhabitants thank the Empire Man for his leniency, and now a society that once was able to sustain itself, all by its own hands, has become the property of the Empire. After disease, war, and famine, they have lost everything, from a theft executed entirely in secret in the offices and exchange halls of far-off cities. It has happened again and again, while this entity takes everything. The peoples of Europe, the French people, the British peoples, the Dutch people, these great peoples and civilizations did marvelous things. I am not saying that Britain was a villain. Englishmen, Scotsmen, Welsh, and Irishmen alike, over these centuries, have done marvelous things and done great good in the world. Yet this entity that crawled into London all those centuries ago, that entity that lives around the world, and that is suffocating the United Kingdom as it suffocates many around the world, that entity is something else. It's a system, a way of doing business, it's old relationships, it's debts and agreements, a network, loyalties, leverage, and ways of thinking. That thing is monstrous. The external world and the internal world were growing resentful of the system. The lower classes rejected the economic order. Increasingly, more and more anti-establishment ideological factions would arise. Social media was proliferating dissent, and dissatisfaction was mounting. It looked as though the countries of the West may be entering a new political era. All it would take was a catalyst. The BRICS nations would begin to rise, standing in opposition to the global order, to the influence of the Western powers and their systems. Not only were people in the West seeking new financial systems, but more and more nations of the world wanted to leave. They wanted to leave the financial empire. Britons would begin seeking to leave the European Union, while Americans increasingly looked askance at their trade agreements. Rising nations like China and India would begin asking if they could just build their own systems. It became clear to the ruling powers of the West that they were losing control of their narratives, and with the clock ticking on a deeper, more permanent financial crisis, things felt more dire. The monetary system and the financial order, media and narrative control, the rules-based international order, and global soft power. The ruling powers knew that the walls were closing in, but they thought that they had time. They underestimated how imminent crisis was for them. And so everything sat precarious, everything on edge. But what would it take for it to begin to truly unravel? It would just take a spark.